preface too not merely in the realm of commerce, but in the world of ideas as well. Our age is organizing a regular clearance sale. Everything is to be had at such a bargain that it is questionable whether in the end there is anybody who will want to bid. Every speculative price fixer who conscientiously directs attention to the significant march of modern philosophy, every private docent, tutor, and student, every crofter and cotter in philosophy, is not content with doubting everything but goes further. This preliminary movement they have therefore all of them made, and presumably with such ease that they do not find it necessary to let drop a word about the how. For not even he who anxiously and with deep concern sought a little enlightenment was able to find any such thing, any guiding sign, any little dietetic prescription, as to how one was to comport oneself in supporting this prodigious task. Perhaps it would be untimely and ill-timed to ask them where they are going, but surely it is courteous and unobtrusive to regard it as certain that they have doubted everything, since otherwise it would be a queer thing for them to be going further. But Descartes III did it. Descartes, a venerable, humble, and honest thinker, whose writings surely no one can read without the deepest emotion, did what he said and said what he did. Alas, alack, that is a great rarity in our times. Descartes, as he repeatedly affirmed, did not doubt in matters of faith. Memors tamen, ut jam dictum est, huic lumini naturali tamdiu tantum esse credendum, quamdiu nihil contrarium a Dio ipso revelator. Praeter caetera autumn, memoriae nostri pro summa regula est infigendum, e qui nobis a Dio revelata sunt, ut omnium certissima esse credenda, et quamvis forte lumen rationis, quam maxime clarum et evidens, aliud quid nobis suggerer videretur, sold tamen auctoritati divini podius quam propria nostro judicio fidem esse adhibendum. He did not cry, fire, nor did he make it a duty for everyone to doubt, for Descartes was a quiet and solitary thinker, not a bellowing night watchman. He modestly admitted that his method had importance for him alone, and was justified in part by the bungled knowledge of his earlier years. Nequis igitur putet me hic traditurum aliquam methodum quam unusquisque sequi debit ad rect regendum rationum, elam enim tantum quam ipsemit secutus sum exponer decrevi, sed simul ac elud studium curriculum absolvi, sc. Juventudis, quo decurso mos est in eruditorum numerum cooptari, plain aliud co epi cogiter. 5. What those ancient Greeks, who also had some understanding of philosophy, regarded as a task for a whole lifetime, seeing that dexterity in doubting is not acquired in a few days or weeks, what the veteran combatant attained when he had preserved the equilibrium of doubt through all the pitfalls he encountered, who intrepidly denied the certainty of sense perception and the certainty of the processes of thought, incorruptibly defied the apprehensions of self-love and the insinuations of sympathy. That is where everybody begins in our time. Tot enim me dubiis tot erroribus implicatum esse animadverti, ut omnes descendi canatus nihil aliud mihi profuis judicarem, quam quod ignorantium me magis magisque detexissum. In our time, nobody is content to stop with faith, but wants to go further. It would perhaps be rash to ask where these people are going, but it is surely a sign of breeding and culture for me to assume that everybody has faith, for otherwise it would be queer for them to be going further. In those old days it was different. Then faith was a task for a whole lifetime, because it was assumed that dexterity in faith is not acquired in a few days or weeks. When the tried oldster drew near to his last hour, having fought the good fight and kept the faith, his heart was still young enough not to have forgotten that fear and trembling which chastened the youth, which the man indeed held in check, but which no man quite outgrows, except as he might succeed at the earliest opportunity in going further. Where these revered figures arrived, that is the point where everybody in our day begins to go further. The present writer is nothing of a philosopher. He has not understood the system, does not know whether it actually exists, whether it is completed. Already he has enough for his weak head in the thought of what a prodigious head everybody in our day must have, since everybody has such a prodigious thought. Even though one were capable of converting the whole content of faith into the form of a concept, it does not follow that one has adequately conceived faith and understands how one got into it, or how it got into one. He can easily foresee his fate in an age when passion has been obliterated in favor of learning, in an age when an author who wants to have readers must take care to write in such a way that the book can easily be perused during the afternoon nap, and take care to fashion his outward deportment in likeness to the picture of that polite young gardener in the advertisement, sheet 7, who with hat in hand and with a good certificate from the place where he last served, recommends himself to the esteemed public. The present writer is nothing of a philosopher. He is, poetus et eleganter, an amateur writer who neither writes the system nor promises 6 of the system, who neither subscribes to the system nor ascribes anything to it. He writes because for him it is a luxury which becomes the more agreeable and more evident, the fewer there are who buy and read what he writes. He has a presentiment of the dreadful event, that a jealous criticism will many a time let him feel the birch. He trembles at the still more dreadful thought that one or another enterprising scribe, a gulper of paragraphs, who to rescue learning is always willing to do with other people's writings what Trop ate, to preserve good taste, magnanimously resolved to do with a book called The Destruction of the Human Race. That is, he will slice the author into paragraphs, and will do it with the same inflexibility as the man who, in the interest of the science of punctuation, divided his discourse by counting the words, so that there were 50 words for a period and 35 for a semicolon. He foresees his fate, that he will be entirely ignored. I prostrate myself with the profoundest deference before every systematic bag-peerer at the custom house, protesting, "This is not the system, it has nothing whatever to do with the system." I call down every blessing upon the system and upon the Danish shareholders in this Omnibus 9, for a tower it is hardly likely to become. I wish them all and sundry good luck and all prosperity. Respectfully, Johannes de silentio prelude. Once upon a time, there was a man who as a child had heard the beautiful story 11 about how God tempted Abraham, and how he endured temptation, kept the faith, and a second time received again a son contrary to expectation. When the child became older, he read the same story with even greater admiration, for life had separated what was united in the pious simplicity of the child. The older he became, the more frequently his mind reverted to that story. His enthusiasm became greater and greater, and yet he was less and less able to understand the story. At last, in his interest for that, he forgot everything else. His soul had only one wish, to see Abraham, one longing, to have been witness to that event. His desire was not to behold the beautiful countries of the Orient, or the earthly glory of the promised land, or that God-fearing couple whose old age God had blessed, or the venerable figure of the aged patriarch, or the vigorous young manhood of Isaac whom God had bestowed upon Abraham. He saw no reason why the same thing might not have taken place on a barren heath in Denmark. His yearning was to accompany them on the 3 days' journey when Abraham rode with sorrow before him, and with Isaac by his side. His only wish was to be present at the time when Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw Mount Moriah afar off, at the time when he left the asses behind and went alone with Isaac up unto the mountain. For what his mind was intent upon was not the ingenious web of imagination, but the shudder of thought. That man was not a thinker. He felt no need of getting beyond faith. He deemed it the most glorious thing to be remembered as the father of it, an enviable lot to possess it, even though no one else were to know it. That man was not a learned exegete. He didn't know Hebrew. If he had known Hebrew, he perhaps would easily have understood the story and Abraham. One and God tempted Abraham and said unto him, Take Isaac, shine only son, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon the mountain which I will show thee. It was early in the morning. Abraham arose betimes. He had the asses saddled, left his tent, and Isaac with him, but Sarah looked out of the window after them until they had passed down the valley, and she could see them no more. 12 they rode in silence for 3 days. On the morning of the 4th day, Abraham said never a word, but he lifted up his eyes and saw Mount Moriah afar off. He left the young men behind and went on alone with Isaac beside him up to the mountain. But Abraham said to himself, I will not conceal from Isaac whither this course leads him. He stood still. He laid his hand upon the head of Isaac in benediction, and Isaac bowed to receive the blessing. And Abraham's face was fatherliness, his look was mild, his speech encouraging. But Isaac was unable to understand him. His soul could not be exalted. He embraced Abraham's knees. He fell at his feet imploringly. He begged for his young life. For the fair hope of his future, he called to mind the joy in Abraham's house. He called to mind the sorrow and loneliness. Then Abraham lifted up the boy. He walked with him by his side, and his talk was full of comfort and exhortation. But Isaac could not understand him. He climbed Mount Moriah, but Isaac understood him not. Then for an instant he turned away from him, and when Isaac again saw Abraham's face it was changed. His glance was wild, his form was horror. He seized Isaac by the throat, threw him to the ground, and said, Stupid boy, dost thou then suppose that I am thy father? I am an idolater. Dost thou suppose that this is God's bidding? No, it is my desire. Then Isaac trembled and cried out in his terror, O God in heaven, have compassion upon me. God of Abraham, have compassion upon me. If I have no father upon earth, be thou my father. But Abraham in a low voice said to himself, O Lord in heaven, I thank thee. After all, it is better for him to believe that I am a monster, rather than that he should lose faith in thee. When the child must be weaned, the mother blackens her breast. It would indeed be a shame that the breast should look delicious when the child must not have it. So the child believes that the breast has changed, but the mother is the same. Her glance is as loving and tender as ever. Happy the person who had no need of more dreadful expedients for weaning the child. It was early in the morning, Abraham arose betimes. He embraced Sarah, the bride of his old age, and Sarah kissed Isaac, who had taken away her reproach, who was her pride, her hope for all time. So they rode on in silence along the way, and Abraham's glance was fixed upon the ground until the fourth day, when he lifted up his eyes and saw afar off Mount Moriah, but his glance turned again to the ground. Silently he laid the wood in order. He bound Isaac. In silence he drew the knife. Then he saw the ram which God had prepared. Then he offered that and returned home. From that time on Abraham became old. He could not forget that God had required this of him. Isaac throve as before, but Abraham's eyes were darkened, and he knew joy no more. When the child has grown big and must be weaned, the mother virginally hides her breast, so the child has no more a mother. Happy the child which did not in another way lose its mother. It was early in the morning, Abraham arose betimes. He kissed Sarah, the young mother, and Sarah kissed Isaac, her delight, her joy at all times. And Abraham rode pensively along the way. He thought of Hagar and of the son whom he drove out into the wilderness. He climbed Mount Moriah. He drew the knife. It was a quiet evening when Abraham rode out alone, and he rode to Mount Moriah. He threw himself upon his face. He prayed God to forgive him his sin, that he had been willing to offer Isaac, that the father had forgotten his duty toward the son. Often he rode his lonely way, but he found no rest. He could not comprehend that it was a sin to be willing to offer to God the best thing he possessed, that for which he would many times have given his life. And if it was a sin, if he had not loved Isaac as he did, then he could not understand that it might be forgiven. For what sin could be more dreadful? When the child must be weaned, the mother too is not without sorrow at the thought that she and the child are separated more and more, that the child which first lay under her heart and later reposed upon her breast will be so near to her no more. So they mourn together for the brief period of mourning. Happy the person who has kept the child as near and needed not to sorrow any more. For it was early in the morning, everything was prepared for the journey in Abraham's house. He bade Sarah farewell, and Eleazar, the faithful servant, followed him along the way until he turned back. They rode together in harmony, Abraham and Isaac, until they came to Mount Moriah. Preface 2. Not merely in the realm of commerce, but in the world of ideas as well, our age is organizing a regular clearance sale. Everything is to be had at such a bargain that it is questionable whether in the end there is anybody who will want to bid. Every speculative price fixer who conscientiously directs attention to the significant march of modern philosophy, every private docent, tutor, and student, every crofter and cotter in philosophy, is not content with doubting everything but goes further. This preliminary movement they have therefore all of them made, and presumably with such ease that they do not find it necessary to let drop a word about the how. For not even he who anxiously and with deep concern sought a little enlightenment was able to find any such thing, any guiding sign, any little dietetic prescription, as to how one was to comport oneself in supporting this prodigious task. Perhaps it would be untimely and ill-timed to ask them where they are going, but surely it is courteous and unobtrusive to regard it as certain that they have doubted everything, since otherwise it would be a queer thing for them to be going further. But Descartes III did it. Descartes, a venerable, humble, and honest thinker, whose writings surely no one can read without the deepest emotion, did what he said and said what he did. Alas, alack, that is a great rarity in our times. Descartes, as he repeatedly affirmed, did not doubt in matters of faith. Memors tamen, ut jam dictum est, huic lumini naturali tamdiu tantum esse credendum, quamdiu nihil contrarium a Dio ipso revelator. Praeter caetera autem, memoriae nostri pro summa regula est infigendum, e qui nobis a Dio revelata sunt, ut omnium certissima esse credenda, et quamvis forte lumen rationis, quam maxime clarum et evidens, aliud quid nobis suggerer videretur, soled tamen auctoritati divini podius quam propria nostro judicio fidem esse adhibendum. He did not cry, fire, nor did he make it a duty for everyone to doubt, for Descartes was a quiet and solitary thinker, not a bellowing night watchman. He modestly admitted that his method had importance for him alone, and was justified in part by the bungled knowledge of his earlier years. Nequis igitur putet me hic traditurum aliquam methodum quam unusquisque sequi debit ad rect regendum rationum, elam enim tantum quam ipsemit secutus sum exponer decrevi, sed simul ac elud studerum curriculum absolvi, sc. Juventudis, quo decurso mos est in eruditorum numerum cooptari, plain aliud co epi cogiter. 5. What those ancient Greeks, who also had some understanding of philosophy, regarded as a task for a whole lifetime, seeing that dexterity in doubting is not acquired in a few days or weeks, what the veteran combatant attained when he had preserved the equilibrium of doubt through all the pitfalls he encountered, who intrepidly denied the certainty of sense perception and the certainty of the processes of thought, incorruptibly defied the apprehensions of self-love and the insinuations of sympathy. That is where everybody begins in our time. Tot enim me dubiis tot erroribus implicatum esse animadverti, ut omnes descendi canatus nihil aliud mihi profuis judicarum, quam quod ignorantium me magis magisque detexissum. In our time, nobody is content to stop with faith, but wants to go further. It would perhaps be rash to ask where these people are going, but it is surely a sign of breeding and culture for me to assume that everybody has faith, for otherwise it would be queer for them to be going further. In those old days it was different. Then faith was a task for a whole lifetime, because it was assumed that dexterity in faith is not acquired in a few days or weeks. When the tried oldster drew near to his last hour, having fought the good fight and kept the faith, his heart was still young enough not to have forgotten that fear and trembling which chastened the youth, which the man indeed held in check, but which no man quite outgrows, except as he might succeed at the earliest opportunity in going further. Where these revered figures arrived, That is the point where everybody in our day begins to go further. The present writer is nothing of a philosopher. He has not understood the system, does not know whether it actually exists, whether it is completed. Already he has enough for his weak head in the thought of what a prodigious head everybody in our day must have, since everybody has such a prodigious thought. Even though one were capable of converting the whole content of faith into the form of a concept, it does not follow that one has adequately conceived faith and understands how one got into it, or how it got into one. He can easily foresee his fate in an age when passion has been obliterated in favor of learning, in an age when an author who wants to have readers must take care to write in such a way that the book can easily be perused during the afternoon nap, and take care to fashion his outward deportment in likeness to the picture of that polite young gardener in the advertisement, sheet 7, who with hat in hand and with a good certificate from the place where he last served, recommends himself to the esteemed public. The present writer is nothing of a philosopher. He is, poetus et eleganter, an amateur writer who neither writes the system nor promises 6 of the system, who neither subscribes to the system nor ascribes anything to it. He writes because for him it is a luxury which becomes the more agreeable and more evident, the fewer there are who buy and read what he writes. He has a presentiment of the dreadful event, that a jealous criticism will many a time let him feel the birch. He trembles at the still more dreadful thought that one or another enterprising scribe, a gulper of paragraphs, who to rescue learning is always willing to do with other people's writings what Trop ate, to preserve good taste, magnanimously resolved to do with a book called The Destruction of the Human Race. That is, he will slice the author into paragraphs, and will do it with the same inflexibility as the man who, in the interest of the science of punctuation, divided his discourse by counting the words, so that there were 50 words for a period and 35 for a semicolon. He foresees his fate, that he will be entirely ignored. I prostrate myself with the profoundest deference before every systematic bag-peerer at the custom house, protesting, "This is not the system, it has nothing whatever to do with the system." I call down every blessing upon the system and upon the Danish shareholders in this Omnibus 9, for a tower it is hardly likely to become. I wish them all and sundry good luck and all prosperity. Respectfully, Johannes de silentio prelude. Once upon a time, there was a man who as a child had heard the beautiful story 11 about how God tempted Abraham, and how he endured temptation, kept the faith, and a second time received again a son contrary to expectation. When the child became older, he read the same story with even greater admiration, for life had separated what was united in the pious simplicity of the child. The older he became, the more frequently his mind reverted to that story. His enthusiasm became greater and greater, and yet he was less and less able to understand the story. At last, in his interest for that, he forgot everything else. His soul had only one wish, to see Abraham, one longing, to have been witness to that event. His desire was not to behold the beautiful countries of the Orient, or the earthly glory of the promised land, or that God-fearing couple whose old age God had blessed, or the venerable figure of the aged patriarch, or the vigorous young manhood of Isaac whom God had bestowed upon Abraham. He saw no reason why the same thing might not have taken place on a barren heath in Denmark. His yearning was to accompany them on the 3 days' journey when Abraham rode with sorrow before him, and with Isaac by his side. His only wish was to be present at the time when Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw Mount Moriah afar off, at the time when he left the asses behind and went alone with Isaac up unto the mountain. For what his mind was intent upon was not the ingenious web of imagination, but the shudder of thought. That man was not a thinker. He felt no need of getting beyond faith. He deemed it the most glorious thing to be remembered as the father of it, an enviable lot to possess it, even though no one else were to know it. That man was not a learned exegete. He didn't know Hebrew. If he had known Hebrew, he perhaps would easily have understood the story and Abraham. One and God tempted Abraham and said unto him, Take Isaac, shine only son, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon the mountain which I will show thee. It was early in the morning. Abraham arose betimes. He had the asses saddled, left his tent, and Isaac with him, but Sarah looked out of the window after them until they had passed down the valley, and she could see them no more. 12 they rode in silence for 3 days. On the morning of the 4th day, Abraham said never a word, but he lifted up his eyes and saw Mount Moriah afar off. He left the young men behind and went on alone with Isaac beside him up to the mountain. But Abraham said to himself, I will not conceal from Isaac whither this course leads him. He stood still. He laid his hand upon the head of Isaac in benediction, and Isaac bowed to receive the blessing. And Abraham's face was fatherliness, his look was mild, his speech encouraging. But Isaac was unable to understand him. His soul could not be exalted. He embraced Abraham's knees. He fell at his feet imploringly. He begged for his young life. For the fair hope of his future, he called to mind the joy in Abraham's house. He called to mind the sorrow and loneliness. Then Abraham lifted up the boy. He walked with him by his side, and his talk was full of comfort and exhortation. But Isaac could not understand him. He climbed Mount Moriah, but Isaac understood him not. Then for an instant he turned away from him, and when Isaac again saw Abraham's face it was changed. His glance was wild, his form was horror. He seized Isaac by the throat, threw him to the ground, and said, Stupid boy, dost thou then suppose that I am thy father? I am an idolater. Dost thou suppose that this is God's bidding? No, it is my desire. Then Isaac trembled and cried out in his terror, O God in heaven, have compassion upon me. God of Abraham, have compassion upon me. If I have no father upon earth, be thou my father. But Abraham in a low voice said to himself, O Lord in heaven, I thank thee. After all, it is better for him to believe that I am a monster, rather than that he should lose faith in thee. When the child must be weaned, the mother blackens her breast. It would indeed be a shame that the breast should look delicious when the child must not have it. So the child believes that the breast has changed, but the mother is the same. Her glance is as loving and tender as ever. Happy the person who had no need of more dreadful expedients for weaning the child. 2 It was early in the morning. Abraham arose betimes. He embraced Sarah, the bride of his old age, and Sarah kissed Isaac, who had taken away her reproach, who was her pride, her hope for all time. So they rode on in silence along the way, and Abraham's glance was fixed upon the ground until the fourth day, when he lifted up his eyes and saw afar off Mount Moriah, but his glance turned again to the ground. Silently he laid the wood in order. He bound Isaac. In silence he drew the knife. Then he saw the ram which God had prepared. Then he offered that and returned home. From that time on Abraham became old. He could not forget that God had required this of him. Isaac throve as before, but Abraham's eyes were darkened, and he knew joy no more. When the child has grown big and must be weaned, the mother virginally hides her breast, so the child has no more a mother. Happy the child which did not in another way lose its mother. 3. It was early in the morning. Abraham arose betimes. He kissed Sarah, the young mother, and Sarah kissed Isaac, her delight, her joy at all times. And Abraham rode pensively along the way. He thought of Hagar and of the son whom he drove out into the wilderness. He climbed Mount Moriah. He drew the knife. It was a quiet evening when Abraham rode out alone, and he rode to Mount Moriah. He threw himself upon his face. He prayed God to forgive him his sin, that he had been willing to offer Isaac, that the father had forgotten his duty toward the son. Often he rode his lonely way, but he found no rest. He could not comprehend that it was a sin to be willing to offer to God the best thing he possessed, that for which he would many times have given his life. And if it was a sin, if he had not loved Isaac as he did, then he could not understand that it might be forgiven. For what sin could be more dreadful? When the child must be weaned, the mother too is not without sorrow at the thought that she and the child are separated more and more, that the child which first lay under her heart and later reposed upon her breast will be so near to her no more. So they mourn together for the brief period of mourning. Happy the person who has kept the child as near and needed not to sorrow any more. For it was early in the morning, everything was prepared for the journey in Abraham's house. He bade Sarah farewell, and Eleazar, the faithful servant, followed him along the way until he turned back. They rode together in harmony, Abraham and Isaac, until they came to Mount Moriah. But Abraham prepared everything for the sacrifice calmly and quietly. But when he turned and drew the knife, Isaac saw that his left hand was clenched in despair, that a tremor passed through his body. But Abraham drew the knife. Then they returned again home, and Sarah hastened to meet them, but Isaac had lost his faith. No word of this had ever been spoken in the world, and Isaac never talked to anyone about what he had seen, and Abraham did not suspect that anyone had seen it. When the child must be weaned, the mother has stronger food in readiness, lest the child should perish. Every time he returned home after wandering to Mount Moriah, he sank down with weariness. He folded his hands and said, "No one is so great as Abraham. Who is capable of understanding him?" A panegyric upon Abraham if there were no eternal consciousness in a man, if at the foundation of all there lay only a wildly seething power, which writhing with obscure passions produced everything that is great and everything that is insignificant, if a bottomless void never satiated lay hidden beneath all. What then would life be but despair? If such were the case, if there were no sacred bond which united mankind, if one generation arose after another like the leafage in the forest, if the one generation replaced the other like the song of birds in the forest, if the human race passed through the world as the ship goes through the sea, like the wind through the desert, a thoughtless and fruitless activity, if an eternal oblivion were always lurking hungrily for its prey, and there was no power strong enough to wrest it from its maw, how empty then and comfortless life would be. But therefore it is not thus, but as God created man and woman, so too he fashioned the hero and the poet or orator. Happy the person who has stronger food in readiness. Thus, and in many like ways, that man of whom we are speaking thought concerning this event. The poet cannot do what that other does. He can only admire, love, and rejoice in the hero. Yet he too is happy, and not less so, for the hero is as it were his better nature, with which he is in love, rejoicing in the fact that this after all is not himself, that his love can be admiration. He is the genius of recollection, can do nothing except call to mind what has been done, do nothing but admire what has been done. He contributes nothing of his own, but is jealous of the entrusted treasure. He follows the option of his heart, but when he has found what he sought, he wanders before every man's door with his song and with his oration, that all may admire the hero as he does, be proud of the hero as he is. This is his achievement, his humble work. This is his faithful service in the house of the hero. If he thus remains true to his love, he strives day and night against the cunning of oblivion which would trick him out of his hero. Then he has completed his work. Then he is gathered to the hero, who has loved him just as faithfully. For the poet is as it were the hero's better nature, powerless it may be as a memory is, but also transfigured as a memory is. Hence no one shall be forgotten who was great, and though time tarries long, though a cloud 13 of misunderstanding takes the hero away, his lover comes nevertheless, and the longer the time that has passed, the more faithfully will he cling to him. No, not one shall be forgotten who was great in the world. But each was great in his own way, and each in proportion to the greatness of that which he loved. For he who loved himself became great by himself, and he who loved other men became great by his selfless devotion, but he who loved God became greater than all. Everyone shall be remembered, but each became great in proportion to his expectation. One became great by expecting the possible, another by expecting the eternal, but he who expected the impossible became greater than all. Everyone shall be remembered, but each was great in proportion to the greatness of that with which he strove. For he who strove with the world became great by overcoming the world, and he who strove with himself became great by overcoming himself, but he who strove with God became greater than all. So there was strife in the world, man against man, 1 against 1,000, but he who strove with God was greater than all. There was one who was great by reason of his power, and one who was great by reason of his wisdom, and one who was great by reason of his hope, and one who was great by reason of his love. But Abraham was greater than all, great by reason of his power whose strength is impotence, great by reason of his wisdom whose secret is foolishness, great by reason of his hope whose form is madness, great by reason of the love which is hatred of oneself. So there was strife upon earth. There was one who overcame all by his power, and there was one who overcame God by his impotence. There was one who relied upon himself and gained all. There was one who secure in his strength sacrificed all, but he who believed God was greater than all. By faith Abraham went out from the land of his fathers and became a sojourner in the land of promise. He left one thing behind, took one thing with him. He left his earthly understanding behind and took faith with him. Otherwise he would not have wandered forth, but would have thought this unreasonable. By faith he was a stranger in the land of promise, and there was nothing to recall what was dear to him, but by its novelty everything tempted his soul to melancholy yearning. And yet he was God's elect, in whom the Lord was well pleased. Yea, if he had been disowned, cast off from God's grace, he could have comprehended it better. But now it was like a mockery of him and of his faith. There was in the world one too who lived in banishment 14 from the fatherland he loved. He is not forgotten, nor his lamentations when he sorrowfully sought and found what he had lost. There is no song of lamentations by Abraham. It is human to lament, human to weep with them that weep, but it is greater to believe, more blessed to contemplate the believer. By faith Abraham received the promise that in his seed all races of the world would be blessed. Time passed, the possibility was there, Abraham believed. Time passed, it became unreasonable, Abraham believed. There was in the world one who had an expectation. Time passed, the evening drew nigh, he was not paltry enough to have forgotten his expectation. Therefore he too shall not be forgotten. Then he sorrowed, and sorrow did not deceive him as life had done. It did for him all it could. In the sweetness of sorrow he possessed his delusive expectation. It is human to sorrow with them that sorrow, but it is greater to believe, more blessed to contemplate the believer. There is no song of lamentations by Abraham. He did not mournfully count the days while time passed. He did not look at Sarah with a suspicious glance, wondering whether she were growing old. He did not arrest the course of the sun, that Sarah might not grow old, and his expectation with her. He did not sing lullingly before Sarah his mournful lay. Abraham became old, Sarah became a laughingstock in the land, and yet he was God's elect, an inheritor of the promise that in his seed all the races of the world would be blessed. So were it not better if he had not been God's elect? What is it to be God's elect? It is to be denied in youth the wishes of youth, so as with great pains to get them fulfilled in old age. But Abraham believed and held fast the expectation. If Abraham had wavered, he would have given it up. If he had said to God, "Then perhaps it is not after all thy will that it should come to pass, so I will give up the wish. It was my only wish, it was my bliss. My soul is sincere. I hide no secret malice because thou didst deny it to me." He would not have been forgotten. He would have saved many by his example, yet he would not be the father of faith. For it is great to give up one's wish, but it is greater to hold it fast after having given it up. It is great to grasp the eternal, but it is greater to hold fast to the temporal after having given it up. 15 Then came the fullness of time. If Abraham had not believed, Sarah surely would have been dead of sorrow, and Abraham, dulled by grief, would not have understood the fulfillment but would have smiled at it as at a dream of youth. But Abraham believed, therefore he was young. For he who always hopes for the best becomes old, and he who is always prepared for the worst grows old early, but he who believes preserves an eternal youth. Praise therefore to that story. For Sarah, though stricken in years, was young enough to desire the pleasure of motherhood, and Abraham, though gray-haired, was young enough to wish to be a father. In an outward respect, the marvel consists in the fact that it came to pass according to their expectation. In a deeper sense, the miracle of faith consists in the fact that Abraham and Sarah were young enough to wish, and that faith had preserved their wish and therewith their youth. He accepted the fulfillment of the promise. He accepted it by faith, and it came to pass according to the promise and according to his faith. For Moses smote the rock with his rod, but he did not believe. Then there was joy in Abraham's house, when Sarah became a bride on the day of their golden wedding. But it was not to remain thus. Still once more Abraham was to be tried. He had fought with that cunning power which invents everything, with that alert enemy which never slumbers, with that old man who outlives all things. He had fought with time and preserved his faith. Now all the terror of the strife was concentrated in one instant. And God tempted Abraham and said unto him, Take Isaac, thine only son, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon the mountain which I will show thee. So all was lost, more dreadfully than if it had never come to pass. So the Lord was only making sport of Abraham. He made miraculously the preposterous actual, and now in turn he would annihilate it. It was indeed foolishness, but Abraham did not laugh at it like Sarah when the promise was announced. All was lost. 70 years of faithful expectation, the brief joy at the fulfillment of faith. Who then is he that plucks away the old man's staff? Who is it that requires that he himself shall break it? Who is he that would make a man's gray hairs comfortless? Who is it that requires that he himself shall do it? Is there no compassion for the venerable oldling, none for the innocent child? And yet Abraham was God's elect, and it was the Lord who imposed the trial. All would now be lost. The glorious memory to be preserved by the human race, the promise in Abraham's seed. This was only a whim, a fleeting thought which the Lord had had, which Abraham should now obliterate. For what significance had it when Isaac was to be sacrificed? That sad and yet blissful hour when Abraham was to take leave of all that was dear to him, when yet once more he was to lift up his head, when his countenance would shine like that of the Lord, when he would concentrate his whole soul in a blessing which was potent to make Isaac blessed all his days. This time would not come, for he would indeed take leave of Isaac, but in such a way that he himself would remain behind. Death would separate them, but in such a way that Isaac remained its prey. That glorious treasure which was just as old as faith in Abraham's heart, many, many years older than Isaac, the fruit of Abraham's life, sanctified by prayers, matured in conflict, the blessing upon Abraham's lips, this fruit was now to be plucked prematurely and remain without significance. The old man would not be joyful in death as he laid his hands in blessing upon Isaac, but he would be weary of life as he laid violent hands upon Isaac. And it was God who tried him. Yea, woe, woe unto the messenger who had come before Abraham with such tidings. Who would have ventured to be the emissary of this sorrow? But it was God who tried Abraham. Yet Abraham believed, and believed for this life. Yea, if his faith had been only for a future life, he surely would have cast everything away in order to hasten out of this world to which he did not belong. But Abraham believed precisely for this life, that he was to grow old in the land, honored by the people, blessed in his generation, remembered forever in Isaac, his dearest thing in life, whom he embraced with a love for which it would be a poor expression to say that he loyally fulfilled the Father's duty of loving the Son, as indeed is evinced in the words of the summons, "The Son whom thou lovest." But Abraham's faith was not of this sort, if there be such a faith. For really this is not faith but the furthest possibility of faith which has a presentiment of its object at the extremest limit of the horizon, yet is separated from it by a yawning abyss within which despair carries on its game. Jacob had 12 sons, and one of them he loved. Abraham had only one, the son whom he loved. If Abraham had doubted, then he would have done something else, something glorious. For how could Abraham do anything but what is great and glorious? He would have marched up to Mount Moriah, he would have cleft the firewood, lit the pyre, drawn the knife. He would have cried out to God, "Despise not this sacrifice. It is not the best thing I possess, that I know well, for what is an old man in comparison with the child of promise, but it is the best I am able to give thee." Yet Abraham believed and did not doubt, he believed the preposterous. Let Isaac never come to know this, that he may console himself with his youth. He would have plunged the knife into his own breast. He would have been admired in the world, and his name would not have been forgotten. But it is one thing to be admired, and another to be the guiding star which saves the anguished. Thou to whom my speech is addressed was such the case with thee. When afar off thou didst see the heavy dispensation of providence approaching thee, didst thou not say to the mountains, "Fall on me," and to the hills, "Cover me"? Or if thou wast stronger, did not thy foot move slowly along the way, longing as it were for the old path? When a call was issued to thee, didst thou answer, or didst thou not answer perhaps in a low voice, whisperingly? Not so Abraham. Joyfully, buoyantly, confidently, with a loud voice he answered, "Here am I." But Abraham believed. He did not pray for himself with the hope of moving the Lord. It was only when the righteous punishment was decreed upon Sodom and Gomorrah that Abraham came forward with his prayers. We read in those holy books, "And God tempted Abraham, and said unto him, Abraham, Abraham, where art thou? And he said, Here am I." We read further, "And Abraham rose early in the morning, as though it were to a festival, so he hastened. And early in the morning he had come to the place spoken of, to Mount Moriah. He said nothing to Sarah, nothing to Eliezer. Indeed, who could understand him? Had not the temptation by its very nature exacted of him an oath of silence? He cleft the wood, he bound Isaac, he lit the pyre, he drew the knife. My hearer, there was many a father who believed that with his son he lost everything that was dearest to him in the world, that he was deprived of every hope for the future. But yet there was none that was the child of promise in the sense that Isaac was for Abraham. There was many a father who lost his child, but then it was God, it was the unalterable, the unsearchable will of the Almighty. It was his hand took the child. Not so with Abraham. For him was reserved a harder trial, and Isaac's fate was laid along with the knife in Abraham's hand. And there he stood, the old man, with his only hope. But he did not doubt. He did not look anxiously to the right or to the left. He did not challenge heaven with his prayers. He knew that it was God the Almighty who was trying him. He knew that it was the hardest sacrifice that could be required of him. But he knew also that no sacrifice was too hard when God required it, and he drew the knife. Who gave strength to Abraham's arm? Who held his right hand up so that it did not fall limp at his side? He who gazes at this becomes paralyzed. Who gave strength to Abraham's soul, so that his eyes did not grow dim, so that he saw neither Isaac nor the ram? He who gazes at this becomes blind. If Abraham, when he stood upon Mount Moriah, had doubted, if he had gazed about him irresolutely, if before he drew the knife he had by chance discovered the ram, if God had permitted him to offer it instead of Isaac, then he would have betaken himself home. Everything would have been the same. He has Sarah. He retained Isaac, and yet how changed! For his retreat would have been a flight, his salvation an accident, his reward dishonor, his future perhaps perdition. And yet rare enough perhaps is the man who becomes paralyzed and blind, still more rare one who worthily recounts what happened. We all know it. It was only a trial. Then he would have borne witness neither to his faith nor to God's grace, but would have teshfied only how dreadful it is to march out to Mount Moriah. Then Abraham would not have been forgotten, nor would Mount Moriah. This mountain would then be mentioned, not like Ararat where the ark landed, but would be spoken of as a consternation, because it was here that Abraham doubted. Venerable Father Abraham, thousands of years have run their course since those days, but thou hast need of no tardy lover to snatch the memorial of thee from the power of oblivion, for every language calls thee to remembrance. And yet thou cost reward thy lover more gloriously than does any other. Hereafter thou cost make him blessed in thy bosom. Here thou cost enthrall his eyes and his heart by the marvel of thy deed. Venerable Father Abraham, second father of the human race, thou who first wast sensible of and didst first bear witness to that prodigious passion, which disdains the dreadful conflict with the rage of the elements, and with the powers of creation in order to strive with God, thou who first didst know that highest passion, the holy, pure, and humble expression of the divine madness 16 which the pagans admired, forgive him who would speak in praise of thee, if he does not do it fittingly. Venerable Father Abraham, in marching home from Mount Moriah thou hadst no need of a panegyric which might console thee for thy loss, for thou didst gain all and didst retain Isaac. Was it not so? Never again did the Lord take him from thee, but thou didst sit at table joyfully with him in thy tent, as thou cost in the beyond to all eternity. He spoke humbly, as if it were the desire of his own heart. He spoke briefly, as it becomes him to do. But he will never forget that thou hadst need of 100 years to obtain a son of old age against expectation, that thou didst have to draw the knife before retaining Isaac. He will never forget that in 130 years thou didst not get further than to faith. Problemata. Preliminary expectoration, an old proverb fetched from the outward and visible world, says, "Only the man that works gets the bread." Strangely enough, this proverb does not aptly apply in that world to which it expressly belongs. For the outward world is subjected to the law of imperfection, and again, the experience is repeated that he too who does not work gets the bread, and that he who sleeps gets it more abundantly than the man who works. In the outward world everything is made payable to the bearer. This world is in bondage to the law of indifference, and to him who has the ring, The spirit of the ring is obedient, whether he be Nureddin or Aladdin 17, and he who has the world's treasure has it however he got it. It is different in the world of spirit. Here an eternal divine order prevails. Here it does not rain both upon the just and upon the unjust. Here the sun does not shine both upon the good and upon the evil. Here it holds good that only he who works gets the bread, only he who was in anguish finds repose, only he who descends into the underworld rescues the beloved, only he who draws the knife gets Isaac. He who will not work does not get the bread but remains deluded, as the gods deluded Orpheus with an airy figure in place of the loved one, deluded him because he was effeminate, not courageous, because he was a cithara player, not a man. Here it is of no use to have Abraham for one's father, nor to have 17 ancestors. He who will not work must take note of what is written about the maidens of Israel 18, for he gives birth to wind. But he who is willing to work gives birth to his own father. There is a knowledge which would presumptuously introduce into the world of spirit the same law of indifference under which the external world sighs. It counts it enough to think the great, other work is not necessary. But therefore it doesn't get the bread, it perishes of hunger, while everything is transformed into gold. And what does it really know? There were many thousands of Greek contemporaries, and countless numbers in subsequent generations, who knew all the triumphs of Miltiades, but only 119 was made sleepless by them. There were countless generations which knew by rote, word for word, the story of Abraham. How many were made sleepless by it? Now the story of Abraham has the remarkable property that it is always glorious, however poorly one may understand it. Yet here again the proverb applies, that all depends upon whether one is willing to labor and be heavy laden. But they will not labor, and yet they would understand the story. They exalt Abraham, but how? They express the whole thing in perfectly general terms. The great thing was that he loved God so much that he was willing to sacrifice to him the best. That is very true, but the best is an indefinite expression. In the course of thought, as the tongue wags on, Isaac and the best are confidently identified, and he who meditates can very well smoke his pipe during the meditation, and the auditor can very well stretch out his legs in comfort. In case that rich young man whom Christ encountered on the road had sold all his goods and given to the poor, we should extol him, as we do all that is great, though without labor we would not understand him. And yet he would not have become an Abraham, in spite of the fact that he offered his best. What they leave out of Abraham's history is dread. 20 For to money I have no ethical obligation, but to the son the father has the highest and most sacred obligation. Dread, however, is a perilous thing for effeminate natures, hence they forget it, and in spite of that they want to talk about Abraham. So they talk. In the course of the oration they use indifferently the two terms, Isaac and the best. All goes famously. However, if it chanced that among the auditors there was one who suffered from insomnia, then the most dreadful, the profoundest tragic and comic misunderstanding lies very close. He went home. He would do as Abraham did, for the son is indeed the best. If the orator got to know of it, he perhaps went to him. He summoned all his clerical dignity. He shouted, "O abominable man, offscouring of society, What devil possessed thee to want to murder thy son? And the parson, who had not been conscious of warmth or perspiration in preaching about Abraham, is astonished at himself, at the earnest wrath which he thundered down upon that poor man. He was delighted with himself, for he had never spoken with such verve and unction. He said to himself and to his wife, I am an orator. What I lacked was the occasion. When I talked about Abraham on Sunday, I did not feel moved in the least. In case the same orator had a little superabundance of reason which might be lost, I think he would have lost it if the sinner were to say calmly and with dignity, that in fact is what you yourself preached on Sunday. How could the parson be able to get into his head such a consequence? And yet it was so, and the mistake was merely that he didn't know what he was saying. Or if the sinner, without raising any objection, were to be converted by the parson's severe lecture, if the zealous clergyman were to go joyfully home, rejoicing in the consciousness that he not only was effective in the pulpit, but above all by his irresistible power as a pastor of souls, who on Sunday roused the congregation to enthusiasm, and on Monday, like a cherub with a flaming sword, placed himself before the man who by his action wanted to put to shame the old proverb, that things don't go on in the world as the parson preaches. Would there were a poet who might resolve to prefer such situations, rather than the stuff and nonsense with which comedies and novels are filled. The comic and the tragic here touch one another at the absolute point of infinity. The parson's speech was perhaps in itself ludicrous enough, but it became infinitely ludicrous by its effect, and yet this consequence was quite natural. In the old days they said, what a pity things don't go on in the world as the parson preaches. Perhaps the time is coming, especially with the help of philosophy, when they will say, fortunately things don't go on as the parson preaches. For after all there is some sense in life, but none at all in his preaching. If, on the other hand, the sinner was not convinced, his situation is pretty tragic. Presumably, he would be executed or sent to the lunatic asylum. In short, he would have become unhappy in relation to so-called reality. In another sense, I can well think that Abraham made him happy, for he that labors does not perish. How is one to explain the contradiction illustrated by that orator? Is it because Abraham had a prescriptive right to be a great man, so that what he did is great, and when another does the same it is sin, a heinous sin? In that case, I do not wish to participate in such thoughtless eulogy. If faith does not make it a holy act to be willing to murder one's son, then let the same condemnation be pronounced upon Abraham as upon every other man. If a man perhaps lacks courage to carry his thought through, and to say that Abraham was a murderer, then it is surely better to acquire this courage, rather than waste time upon undeserved eulogies. The ethical expression for what Abraham did is that he would murder Isaac. The religious expression is that he would sacrifice Isaac. But precisely in this contradiction consists the dread which can well make a man sleepless, and yet Abraham is not what he is without this dread. Or perhaps he did not do at all what is related, but something altogether different, which is accounted for by the circumstances of his times. Then let us forget him. For it is not worth while to remember that past which cannot become a present. Or had perhaps that orator forgotten something which corresponds to the ethical forgetfulness of the fact that Isaac was the son? For when faith is eliminated by becoming null or nothing, then there only remains the crude fact that Abraham wanted to murder Isaac, which is easy enough for anyone to imitate who has not faith, the faith, that is to say, which makes it hard for him. For my part, I do not lack the courage to think a thought whole. Hitherto there has been no thought I have been afraid of. If I should run across such a thought, I hope that I have at least the sincerity to say, I am afraid of this thought, it stirs up something else in me, and therefore I will not think it. If in this I do wrong, the punishment will not fail to follow. If I had recognized that it was the verdict of truth that Abraham was a murderer, I do not know whether I would have been able to silence my pious veneration for him. However, if I had thought that, I presumably would have kept silent about it, for one should not initiate others into such thoughts. But Abraham is no dazzling illusion. He did not sleep into renown. It was not a whim of fate. Can one then speak plainly about Abraham without incurring the danger that an individual might in bewilderment go ahead and do likewise? If I do not dare to speak freely, I will be completely silent about Abraham. Above all, I will not disparage him in such a way that precisely thereby he becomes a pitfall for the weak. For if one makes faith everything, that is, makes it what it is, then, according to my way of thinking, one may speak of it without danger in our age, which hardly extravagates in the matter of faith, and it is only by faith one attains likeness to Abraham, not by murder. If one makes love a transitory mood, a voluptuous emotion in a man, then one only lays pitfalls for the weak when one would talk about the exploits of love. Transient emotions every man surely has, but if as a consequence of such emotions one would do the terrible thing which love has sanctified as an immortal exploit, then all is lost, including the exploit and the bewildered doer of it. So one surely can talk about Abraham, for the great can never do harm when it is apprehended in its greatness. It is like a two-edged sword which slays and saves. If it should fall to my lot to talk on the subject, I would begin by showing what a pious and God-fearing man Abraham was, worthy to be called God's elect. Only upon such a man is imposed such a test. But where is there such a man? Next I would describe how Abraham loved Isaac. To this end I would pray all good spirits to come to my aid, that my speech might be as glowing as paternal love is. I hope that I should be able to describe it in such a way that there would not be many a father in the realms and territories of the king who would dare to affirm that he loved his son in such a way. But if he does not love like Abraham, then every thought of offering Isaac would be not a trial but a base temptation Amphictyong. On this theme one could talk for several Sundays. One need be in no haste. The consequence would be that, if one spoke rightly, some few of the fathers would not require to hear more, but for the time being they would be joyful if they really succeeded in loving their sons as Abraham loved. If there was one who, after having heard about the greatness, but also about the dreadfulness of Abraham's deed, ventured to go forth upon that road, I would saddle my horse and ride with him. At every stopping place till we came to Mount Moriah, I would explain to him that he still could turn back, could repent the misunderstanding that he was called to be tried in such a conflict, that he could confess his lack of courage, so that God himself must take Isaac, if he would have him. It is my conviction that such a man is not repudiated, but may become blessed like all the others. But in time he does not become blessed. Would they not, even in the great ages of faith, have passed this judgment upon such a man? I knew a person who on one occasion could have saved my life if he 21 had been magnanimous. He said, "I see well enough what I could do, but I do not dare to. I am afraid that later I might lack strength and that I should regret it." He was not magnanimous, but who for this cause would not continue to love him? Having spoken thus and moved the audience so that at least they had sensed the dialectical conflict of faith and its gigantic passion, I would not give rise to the error on the part of the audience that he then has faith in such a high degree that it is enough for us to hold on to his skirts. For I would add, I have no faith at all. I am by nature a shrewd pate, and every such person always has great difficulty in making the movements of faith. Not that I attach, however, in and for itself, any value to this difficulty which through the overcoming of it brought the clever head further than the point which the simplest and most ordinary man reaches more easily. After all, in the poet's love has its priests, and sometimes one hears a voice which knows how to defend it, but of faith one hears never a word. Who speaks in honor of this passion? Philosophy goes further. Theology sits rouged at the window and courts its favor, offering to sell her charms to philosophy. It is supposed to be difficult to understand Hegel, but to understand Abraham is a trifle. To go beyond Hegel 22 is a miracle, but to get beyond Abraham is the easiest thing of all. I for my part have devoted a good deal of time to the understanding of the Hegelian philosophy. I believe also that I understand it tolerably well. But when in spite of the trouble I have taken there are certain passages I cannot understand, I am foolhardy enough to think that he himself has not been quite clear. All this I do easily and naturally. My head does not suffer from it. But on the other hand, when I have to think of Abraham, I am as though annihilated. I catch sight every moment of that enormous paradox which is the substance of Abraham's life. Every moment I am repelled, and my thought, in spite of all its passion, cannot get a hair's breadth further. I strain every muscle to get a view of it. That very instant I am paralyzed. I am not unacquainted with what has been admired as great and noble in the world. My soul feels affinity with it, being convinced in all humility that it was in my cause the hero contended, and the instant I contemplate his deed I cry out to myself, Jam tua res agitur. 23 I think myself into the hero, but into Abraham I cannot think myself. When I reach the height I fall down, for what I encounter there is the paradox. I do not, however, mean in any sense to say that faith is something lowly, but on the contrary that it is the highest thing, and that it is dishonest of philosophy to give something else instead of it, and to make light of faith. Philosophy cannot and should not give faith, but it should understand itself and know what it has to offer and take nothing away, and least of all should fool people out of something as if it were nothing. I am not unacquainted with the perplexities and dangers of life. I do not fear them, and I encounter them buoyantly. I am not unacquainted with the dreadful. My memory is a faithful wife, and my imagination is, as I myself am not, a diligent little maiden who all day sits quietly at her work, and in the evening knows how to chat to me about it so prettily that I must look at it, though not always, I must say. Is it landscapes or flowers or pastoral idyls she paints? I have seen the dreadful before my own eyes. I do not flee from it timorously, but I know very well that, although I advance to meet it, my courage is not the courage of faith, nor anything comparable to it. I am unable to make the movements of faith. I cannot shut my eyes and plunge confidently into the absurd. For me that is an impossibility, but I do not boast of it. I am convinced that God is love. 24. This thought has for me a primitive lyrical validity. When it is present to me, I am unspeakably blissful. When it is absent, I long for it more vehemently than does the lover for his object. But I do not believe, this courage I lack. For me the love of God is, both in a direct and in an inverse sense, incommensurable with the whole of reality. I am not cowardly enough to whimper and complain, but neither am I deceitful enough to deny that faith is something much higher. I can well endure living in my way. I am joyful and content, but my joy is not that of faith, and in comparison with that it is unhappy. I do not trouble God with my petty sorrows. The particular does not trouble me. I gaze only at my love, and I keep its virginal flame pure and clear. Faith is convinced that God is concerned about the least things. I am content in this life with being married to the left hand. Faith is humble enough to demand the right hand. For that this is humility I do not deny, and shall never deny. But really is everyone in my generation capable of making the movements of faith? I wonder. Unless I am very much mistaken, this generation is rather inclined to be proud of making what they do not even believe I am capable of making, viz., incomplete movements. It is repugnant to me to do as so often is done, namely, to speak inhumanly about a great deed, as though some thousands of years were an immense distance. I would rather speak humanly about it, as though it had occurred yesterday, letting only the greatness be the distance, which either exalts or condemns. So if in the quality of a tragic hero, for I can get no higher, I had been summoned to undertake such a royal progress to Mount Moriah, I know well what I would have done. I would not have been cowardly enough to stay at home, neither would I have laid down or sauntered along the way, nor have forgotten the knife, so that there might be a little delay. I am pretty well convinced that I would have been there on the stroke of the clock, and would have had everything in order. Perhaps I would have arrived too early in order to get through with it sooner. But I also know what else I would have done. The very instant I mounted the horse I would have said to myself, "Now all is lost. God requires Isaac, I sacrifice him, and with him my joy. Yet God is love and continues to be that for me. For in the temporal world God and I cannot talk together, we have no language in common." Perhaps one or another in our age will be foolish enough, or envious enough of the great, to want to make himself and me believe that if I really had done this, I would have done even a greater deed than Abraham. For my prodigious resignation was far more ideal and poetic than Abraham's narrow-mindedness. And yet this is the greatest falsehood, for my prodigious resignation was the surrogate for faith, nor could I do more than make the infinite movement, in order to find myself and again repose in myself. In that case, I would not have loved Isaac as Abraham loved. That I was resolute in making the movement might prove my courage, humanly speaking. That I loved him with all my soul is the presumption apart from which the whole thing becomes a crime. But yet I did not love like Abraham, for in that case I would have held back even at the last minute, though not for this would I have arrived too late at Mount Moriah. Besides, by my behavior I would have spoiled the whole story, for if I had got Isaac back again, I would have been in embarrassment. What Abraham found easiest, I would have found hard, namely to be joyful again with Isaac. For he who with all the infinity of his soul proprio matu et prepares auspices by his own power and on his own responsibility, has performed the infinite movement of resignation, and cannot do more, only retains Isaac with pain. But what did Abraham do? He arrived neither too soon nor too late. He mounted the ass. He rode slowly along the way. All that time he believed. He believed that God would not require Isaac of him, whereas he was willing nevertheless to sacrifice him if it was required. He believed by virtue of the absurd, for there could be no question of human calculation, and it was indeed the absurd that God who required it of him should the next instant recall the requirement. He climbed the mountain. Even at the instant when the knife glittered, he believed that God would not require Isaac. He was indeed astonished at the outcome, but by a double movement he had reached his first position, and therefore he received Isaac more gladly than the first time. Let us go further. We let Isaac be really sacrificed. Abraham believed. He did not believe that someday he would be blessed in the beyond, but that he would be happy here in the world. God could give him a new Isaac, could recall to life him who had been sacrificed. He believed by virtue of the absurd, for all human reckoning had long since ceased to function. That sorrow can derange a man's mind that we see, and it is sad enough. That there is such a thing as strength of will which is able to haul up so exceedingly close to the wind that it saves a man's reason, even though he remains a little queer 25 that 2-1 sees. I have no intention of disparaging this, but to be able to lose one's reason, and therefore the whole of finiteness of which reason is the broker, and then by virtue of the absurd to gain precisely the same finiteness. That appalls my soul, but I do not for this cause say that it is something lowly, since on the contrary it is the only prodigy. Generally people are of the opinion that what faith produces is not a work of art, that it is coarse and common work, only for the more clumsy natures. But in fact this is far from the truth. The dialectic of faith is the finest and most remarkable of all. It possesses an elevation, of which indeed I can form a conception, but nothing more. I am able to make from the springboard the great leap whereby I pass into infinity. My back is like that of a tightrope dancer, having been twisted in my childhood 26, hence I find this easy. With a 1, 2, 3. I can walk about existence on my head, but the next thing I cannot do, for I cannot perform the miraculous, but can only be astonished by it. Yes, if Abraham the instant he swung his leg over the ass's back had said to himself, "Now, since Isaac is lost, I might just as well sacrifice him here at home, rather than ride the long way to Moriah. Then I should have no need of Abraham, whereas now I bow 7 times before his name and 70 times before his deed." For this indeed he did not do, as I can prove by the fact that he was glad at receiving Isaac, heartily glad, that he needed no preparation, no time to concentrate upon the finite and its joy. If this had not been the case with Abraham, then perhaps he might have loved God but not believed. For he who loves God without faith reflects upon himself. He who loves God believingly reflects upon God. He really goes further and reaches faith. For all these caricatures of faith, the miserable lukewarm indolence which thinks, there surely is no instant need, it is not worth while sorrowing before the time, the pitiful hope which says, one cannot know what is going to happen, it might possibly be after all. These caricatures of faith are part and parcel of life's wretchedness, and the infinite resignation has already consigned them to infinite contempt. Upon this pinnacle stands Abraham. The last stage he loses sight of is the infinite resignation. Abraham, I cannot understand 27 in a certain sense. There is nothing I can learn from him but astonishment. If people fancy that, by considering the outcome of this story, they might let themselves be moved to believe, they deceive themselves and want to swindle God out of the first movement of faith, the infinite resignation. They would suck worldly wisdom out of the paradox. Perhaps one or another may succeed in that, for our age is not willing to stop with faith. With its miracle of turning water into wine, it goes further. It turns wine into water. Would it not be better to stop with faith, and is it not revolting that everybody wants to go further? When in our age, as indeed is proclaimed in various ways, they will not stop with love, where then are they going? To earthy wisdom, to petty calculation, to paltriness and wretchedness, to everything which can make man's divine origin doubtful. Would it not be better that they should stand still at faith, and that he who stands should take heed lest he fall? For the movements of faith must constantly be made by virtue of the absurd, yet in such a way, be it observed, that one does not lose the finite but gains it every inch. For my part, I can well describe the movements of faith, but I cannot make them. When one would learn to make the motions of swimming, one can let oneself be hung by a swimming belt from the ceiling and go through the motions, describe them, so to speak, as we speak of describing a circle, but one is not swimming. In that way I can describe the movements of faith, but when I am thrown into the water I swim. It is true, for I don't belong to the beach waders, but I make other movements. I make the movements of infinity, whereas faith does the opposite. After having made the movements of infinity, it makes those of finiteness. Hail to him who can make those movements. He performs the marvelous, and I shall never grow tired of admiring him, whether he be Abraham or a slave in Abraham's house. Whether he be a professor of philosophy or a servant girl, I look only at the movements. But at them I do look, and do not let myself be fooled, either by myself or by any other man. The nights of the infinite resignation are easily recognized. Their gait is gliding and assured. Those, on the other hand, who carry the jewel of faith are likely to be delusive, because their outward appearance bears a striking resemblance to that which both the infinite resignation and faith profoundly despise, to Philistinism. I candidly admit that in my practice I have not found any reliable example of the night of faith, though I would not therefore deny that every second man may be such an example. I have been trying, however, for several years to get on the track of this, and all in vain. People commonly travel around the world to see rivers and mountains, new stars, birds of rare plumage, queerly deformed fishes, ridiculous breeds of men. They abandon themselves to the bestial stupor which gapes at existence, and they think they have seen something. This does not interest me. But if I knew where there was such a knight of faith, I would make a pilgrimage to him on foot, for this prodigy interests me absolutely. I would not let go of him for an instant. Every moment I would watch to see how he managed to make the movements. I would regard myself as secured for life, and would divide my time between looking at him and practicing the exercises myself, and thus would spend all my time admiring him. As was said, I have not found any such person, but I can well think him. Here he is. Acquaintance made, I am introduced to him. The moment I set eyes on him, I instantly push him from me. I myself leap backwards. I clasp my hands and say half aloud, "Good Lord, is this the man? Is it really he? Why, he looks like a tax collector." However, it is the man after all. I draw closer to him, watching his least movements to see whether there might not be visible a little heterogeneous fractional telegraphic message from the infinite. A glance, a look, a gesture, a note of sadness, a smile, which betrayed the infinite in its heterogeneity with the finite. No, I examine his figure from tip to toe to see if there might not be a cranny through which the infinite was peeping. No, he is solid through and through. His tread, it is vigorous, belonging entirely to finiteness. No smartly dressed townsman who walks out to Fresburg on a Sunday afternoon treads the ground more firmly. He belongs entirely to the world, no Philistine more so. One can discover nothing of that aloof and superior nature, whereby one recognizes the night of the infinite. He takes delight in everything, and whenever one sees him taking part in a particular pleasure, he does it with the persistence which is the mark of the earthly man whose soul is absorbed in such things. He tends to his work. So when one looks at him, one might suppose that he was a clerk who had lost his soul in an intricate system of bookkeeping. So precise is he. He takes a holiday on Sunday. He goes to church. No heavenly glance or any other token of the incommensurable betrays him. If one did not know him, it would be impossible to distinguish him from the rest of the congregation, for his healthy and vigorous hymn-singing proves at the most that he has a good chest. In the afternoon he walks to the forest. He takes delight in everything he sees, in the human swarm, in the new omnibuses 25 in the water of the Sound. When one meets him on the beach road, one might suppose he was a shopkeeper taking his fling. That's just the way he disports himself, for he is not a poet, and I have sought in vain to detect in him the poetic incommensurability. Toward evening he walks home. His gait is as indefatigable as that of the postman. On his way he reflects that his wife has surely a special little warm dish prepared for him, e.g. a calf's head roasted, garnished with vegetables. If he were to meet a man like-minded, he could continue as far as Eastgate to discourse with him about that dish, with a passion befitting a hotel chef. As it happens, he hasn't 4 pence to his name, and yet he fully and firmly believes that his wife has that dainty dish for him. If she had it, it would then be an invidious sight for superior people and an inspiring one for the plain man to see him eat, for his appetite is greater than Esau's. His wife hasn't it. Strangely enough, it is quite the same to him. On the way he comes past a building site and runs across another man. They talk together for a moment. In the twinkling of an eye he erects a new building. He has at his disposition all the powers necessary for it. The stranger leaves him with the thought that he certainly was a capitalist, while my admired knight thinks, "Yes, if the money were needed, I dare say I could get it." He lounges at an open window and looks out on the square on which he lives. He is interested in everything that goes on, in a rat which slips under the curb in the children's play, and this with the nonchalance of a girl of 16. And yet he is no genius, for in vain I have sought in him the incommensurability of genius. In the evening he smokes his pipe. To look at him, one would swear that it was the grocer over the way vegetating in the twilight. He lives as carefree as a ne'er-do-well, and yet he buys up the acceptable time at the dearest price, for he does not do the least thing except by virtue of the absurd. With infinite resignation he has drained the cup of life's profound sadness. He knows the bliss of the infinite. He senses the pain of renouncing everything, the dearest things he possesses in the world, and yet finiteness tastes to him just as good as to one who never knew anything higher, for his continuance in the finite did not bear a trace of the cowed and fearful spirit produced by the process of training, and yet he has this sense of security in enjoying it, as though the finite life were the surest thing of all. And yet, actually I could become furious over it, for envy if for no other reason. This man has made, and every instant is making the movements of infinity. And yet the whole earthly form he exhibits is a new creation by virtue of the absurd. He resigned everything infinitely, and then he grasped everything again by virtue of the absurd. He constantly makes the movements of infinity, but he does this with such correctness and assurance that he constantly gets the finite out of it, and there is not a second when one has a notion of anything else. It is supposed to be the most difficult task for a dancer to leap into a definite posture in such a way that there is not a second when he is grasping after the posture, but by the leap itself he stands fixed in that posture. Perhaps no dancer can do it. That is what this knight does. Most people live dejectedly in worldly sorrow and joy. They are the ones who sit along the wall and do not join in the dance. The knights of infinity are dancers and possess elevation. They make the movements upward and fall down again, and this too is no mean pastime, nor ungraceful to behold. But whenever they fall down, they are not able at once to assume the posture. They vacillate an instant, and this vacillation shows that after all they are strangers in the world. This is more or less strikingly evident in proportion to the art they possess, but even the most artistic knights cannot altogether conceal this vacillation. One need not look at them when they are up in the air, but only the instant they touch or have touched the ground. Then one recognizes them. But to be able to fall down in such a way that the same second it looks as if one were standing and walking, to transform the leap of life into a walk, absolutely to express the sublime in the pedestrian, that only the knight of faith can do, and this is the one and only prodigy. But since the prodigy is so likely to be delusive, I will describe the movements in a definite instance which will serve to illustrate their relation to reality, for upon this everything turns. A young swain falls in love with a princess 29, and the whole content of his life consists in this love, and yet the situation is such that it is impossible for it to be realized. Impossible for it to be translated from ideality into reality. Of course, any other instance whatsoever in which the individual finds that, for him, the whole reality of actual existence is concentrated, may, when it is seen to be unrealizable, be an occasion for the movement of resignation. However, I have chosen a love experience to make the movement visible, because this interest is doubtless easier to understand, and so relieves me from the necessity of making preliminary observations which in a deeper sense could be of interest only to a few. The slaves of paltriness, the frogs in life's swamp, will naturally cry out, "Such a love is foolishness." The rich brewer's widow is a match fully as good and respectable. Let them croak in the swamp undisturbed. It is not so with the knight of infinite resignation. He does not give up his love, not for all the glory of the world. He is no fool. First he makes sure that this really is the content of his life, and his soul is too healthy and too proud to squander the least thing upon an inebriation. He is not cowardly. He is not afraid of letting love creep into his most secret, his most hidden thoughts, to let it twine in innumerable coils about every ligament of his consciousness. If the love becomes an unhappy love, he will never be able to tear himself loose from it. He feels a blissful rapture in letting love tingle through every nerve, and yet his soul is as solemn as that of the man who has drained the poisoned goblet, and feels how the juice permeates every drop of blood, for this instant is life and death. 30 so when he has thus sucked into himself the whole of love and absorbed himself in it, he does not lack courage to make trial of everything and to venture everything. He surveys the situation of his life. He convokes the swift thoughts, which like tame doves obey his every bidding. He waves his wand over them, and they dart off in all directions. But when they all return, all as messengers of sorrow, and declare to him that it is an impossibility, then he becomes quiet, he dismisses them, he remains alone, and then he performs the movements. If what I am saying is to have any significance, it is requisite that the movement come about normally. To this end passion is necessary. Every movement of infinity comes about by passion, and no reflection can bring a movement about. This is the continual leap in existence which explains the movement, whereas mediation is a chimera which according to Hegel is supposed to explain everything, and at the same time, this is the only thing he has never tried to explain. Even to make the well-known Socratic distinction between what one understands and what one does not understand, passion is required, and of course even more to make the characteristic Socratic movement, the movement, namely, of ignorance. What our age lacks, however, is not reflection but passion. Hence, in a sense, our age is too tenacious of life to die. For dying is one of the most remarkable leaps, and a little verse of a poet has always attracted me much, because, after having expressed prettily and simply in 5 or 6 preceding lines his wish for good things in life, he concludes thus, 31 ein Seliger sprung in die Ewigkeit. So for the first thing, the knight will have power to concentrate the whole content of life and the whole significance of reality in one single wish. If a man lacks this concentration, this intensity, if his soul from the beginning is dispersed in the multifarious, he never comes to the point of making the movement. He will deal shrewdly in life like the capitalists who invest their money in all sorts of securities, so as to gain on the one what they lose on the other. In short, he is not a knight. In the next place, the knight will have the power to concentrate the whole result of the operations of thought in one act of consciousness. If he lacks this intensity, if his soul from the beginning is dispersed in the multifarious, he will never get time to make the movements. He will be constantly running errands in life, never enter into eternity, for even at the instant when he is closest to it, he will suddenly discover that he has forgotten something for which he must go back. He will think that to enter eternity is possible the next instant, and that also is perfectly true, but by such considerations one never reaches the point of making the movements, but by their aid one sinks deeper and deeper into the mire. So the knight makes the movement, but what movement? Will he forget the whole thing? For in this too there is indeed a kind of concentration. No, for the knight does not contradict himself, and it is a contradiction to forget the whole content of one's life, and yet remain the same man. To become another man he feels no inclination, nor does he by any means regard this as greatness. Only the lower natures forget themselves and become something new. Thus the butterfly has entirely forgotten that it was a caterpillar. Perhaps it may in turn so entirely forget it was a butterfly that it becomes a fish. The deeper natures never forget themselves, and never become anything else than what they were. So the knight remembers everything, but precisely this remembrance is pain, and yet by the infinite resignation he is reconciled with existence. Love for that princess became for him the expression for an eternal love, assumed a religious character, was transfigured into a love for the eternal being, which did to be sure deny him the fulfillment of his love, yet reconciled him again by the eternal consciousness of its validity in the form of eternity, which no reality can take from him. Fools and young men prate about everything being possible for a man. That, however, is a great error. Spiritually speaking, everything is possible, but in the world of the finite there is much which is not possible. This impossible, however, the knight makes possible by expressing it spiritually, but he expresses it spiritually by waiving his claim to it. The wish which would carry him out into reality but was wrecked upon the impossibility is now bent inward, but it is not therefore lost, neither is it forgotten. At one moment, it is the obscure emotion of the wish within him which awakens recollections. At another moment, he awakens them himself, for he is too proud to be willing that what was the whole content of his life should be the thing of a fleeting moment. He keeps this love young, and along with him it increases in years and in beauty. On the other hand, he has no need of the intervention of the finite for the further growth of his love. From the instant he made the movement, the princess is lost to him. He has no need of those erotic tinglings in the nerves at the sight of the beloved, etc. Nor does he need to be constantly taking leave of her in a finite sense, because he recollects her in an eternal sense 32, and he knows very well that the lovers who are so bent upon seeing her, yet once again, to say farewell for the last time, are right in being bent upon it, are right in thinking that it is the last time, for they forget one another the soonest. He has comprehended the deep secret that also in loving another person one must be sufficient unto oneself. He no longer takes a finite interest in what the princess is doing, and precisely this is proof that he has made the movement infinitely. Here one may have an opportunity to see whether the movement on the part of a particular person is true or fictitious. There was one who also believed that he had made the movement, but lo, time passed, the princess did something else. She married 33, a prince, let us say. Then his soul lost the elasticity of resignation. Thereby he knew that he had not made the movement rightly, for he who has made the act of resignation infinitely is sufficient unto himself. The knight does not annul his resignation. He preserves his love just as young as it was in its first moment. He never lets it go from him, precisely because he makes the movements infinitely. What the princess does cannot disturb him. It is only the lower natures which find in other people the law for their actions, which find the premises for their actions outside themselves. If, on the other hand, the princess is like-minded, the beautiful consequence will be apparent. She will introduce herself into that order of knighthood into which one is not received by balloting, but of which everyone is a member who has courage to introduce himself, that order of knighthood which proves its immortality by the fact that it makes no distinction between man and woman. These two will to all eternity remain in agreement with one another, with a well-timed harmonia praestabilita, 34, so that if ever the moment were to come, the moment which does not, however, concern them finitely, for then they would be growing older. If ever the moment were to come which offered to give love its expression in time, then they will be capable of beginning precisely at the point where they would have begun if originally they had been united. The two will preserve their love young and sound. She also will have triumphed over her pains, even though she does not, as it is said in the ballad, lie every night beside her lord. He who understands this, be he man or woman, can never be deceived, for it is only the lower natures which imagine they were deceived. No girl who is not so proud really knows how to love, but if she is so proud, then the cunning and shrewdness of all the world cannot deceive her. In the infinite resignation there is peace and rest. Every man who wills it, who has not abased himself by scorning himself, which is still more dreadful than being proud, can train himself to make this movement which in its pain reconciles one with existence. Infinite resignation is that shirt we read about in the old fable. 35. The thread is spun under tears, the cloth bleached with tears, the shirt sewn with tears. But then, too, it is a better protection than iron and steel. The imperfection in the fable is that a third party can manufacture this shirt. The secret in life is that everyone must sew it for himself, and the astonishing thing is that a man can sew it fully as well as a woman. In the infinite resignation there is peace and rest and comfort in sorrow. That is, if the movement is made normally. It would not be difficult for me, however, to write a whole book, were I to examine the various misunderstandings, the preposterous attitudes, the deceptive movements, which I have encountered in my brief practice. People believe very little in spirit, and yet making this movement depends upon spirit. It depends upon whether this is or is not a one-sided result of a dira necessitas, and if this is present, the more dubious it always is whether the movement is normal. If one means by this that the cold, unfruitful necessity must necessarily be present, one thereby affirms that no one can experience death before he actually dies, and that appears to me a crass materialism. However, In our time, people concern themselves rather little about making pure movements. In case one who was about to learn to dance were to say, "For centuries now one generation after another has been learning positions. It is high time I drew some advantage out of this and began straightway with the French dances," then people would laugh at him. But in the world of spirit, they find this exceedingly plausible. What is education? I should suppose that education was the curriculum one had to run through in order to catch up with oneself, and he who will not pass through this curriculum is helped very little by the fact that he was born in the most enlightened age. The infinite resignation is the last stage prior to faith, so that one who has not made this movement has not faith. For only in the infinite resignation do I become clear to myself with respect to my eternal validity, and only then can there be any question of grasping existence by virtue of faith. Now we will let the knight of faith appear in the role just described. He makes exactly the same movements as the other knight, infinitely renounces claim to the love which is the content of his life. He is reconciled in pain. But then occurs the prodigy. He makes still another movement more wonderful than all, for he says, "I believe nevertheless that I shall get her, in virtue, that is, of the absurd, in virtue of the fact that with God all things are possible." 36. The absurd is not one of the factors which can be discriminated within the proper compass of the understanding. It is not identical with the improbable, the unexpected, the unforeseen. At the moment when the knight made the act of resignation 37, he was convinced, humanly speaking, of the impossibility. This was the result reached by the understanding, and he had sufficient energy to think it. On the other hand, in an infinite sense it was possible, namely, by renouncing it. But this sort of possessing is at the same time a relinquishing, and yet there is no absurdity in this for the understanding. For the understanding continued to be in the right in affirming that in the world of the finite where it holds sway this was, and remained an impossibility. This is quite as clear to the knight of faith. So the only thing that can save him is the absurd, and this he grasps by faith. So he recognizes the impossibility, and that very instant he believes the absurd. For, if without recognizing the impossibility with all the passion of his soul and with all his heart, he should wish to imagine that he has faith, he deceives himself, and his testimony has no bearing, since he has not even reached the infinite resignation. Faith, therefore, is not an aesthetic emotion, but something far higher, precisely because it has resignation as its presupposition. It is not an immediate instinct of the heart, but is the paradox of life and existence. So when in spite of all difficulties, a young girl still remains convinced that her wish will surely be fulfilled, this conviction is not the assurance of faith, even if she was brought up by Christian parents, and for a whole year perhaps has been catechized by the parson. She is convinced in all her childish naivete and innocence. This conviction also ennobles her nature and imparts to her a preternatural greatness, so that like a thaumaturge she is able to conjure the finite powers of existence and make the very stones weep, while on the other hand in her flurry she may just as well run to Herod as to Pilate and move the whole world by her tears. Her conviction is very lovable, and one can learn much from her, but one thing is not to be learned from her. One does not learn the movements, for her conviction does not dare in the pain of resignation to face the impossibility. So I can perceive that it requires strength and energy and freedom of spirit to make the infinite movement of resignation. I can also perceive that it is feasible. But the next thing astonishes me, it makes my head swim, for after having made the movement of resignation, then by virtue of the absurd to get everything, to get the wish whole and uncurtailed, that is beyond human power, it is a prodigy. But this I can perceive, that the young girl's conviction is mere levity in comparison with the firmness faith displays notwithstanding, it has perceived the impossibility. For the act of resignation faith is not required, for what I gain by resignation is my eternal consciousness, and this is a purely philosophical movement which I dare say I am able to make if it is required, and which I can train myself to make, for whenever any finiteness would get the mastery over me, I starve myself until I can make the movement, for my eternal consciousness is my love to God. And for me, this is higher than everything. Whenever I essay to make this movement, I turn giddy. The very instant I am admiring it, absolutely a prodigious dread grips my soul. For what is it to tempt God? And yet this movement is the movement of faith and remains such, even though philosophy, in order to confuse the concepts, would make us believe that it has faith, and even though theology would sell out faith at a bargain price. For the act of resignation faith is not required, but it is needed when it is the case of acquiring the very least thing more than my eternal consciousness, for this is the paradoxical. The movements are frequently confounded, for it is said that one needs faith to renounce the claim to everything. Yea, a stranger thing than this may be heard, when a man laments the loss of his faith, and when one looks at the scale to see where he is, one sees, strangely enough, that he has only reached the point where he should make the infinite movement of resignation. In resignation I make renunciation of everything. This movement I make by myself, and if I do not make it, it is because I am cowardly and effeminate and without enthusiasm, and do not feel the significance of the lofty dignity which is assigned to every man, that of being his own censor, which is a far prouder title than that of censor general to the whole Roman Republic. This movement I make by myself, and what I gain is myself in my eternal consciousness, in blissful agreement with my love for the eternal being. By faith I make renunciation of nothing, on the contrary, by faith I acquire everything, precisely in the sense in which it is said that he who has faith like a grain of mustard can remove mountains. A purely human courage is required to renounce the whole of the temporal to gain the eternal. But this I gain, and to all eternity I cannot renounce it. That is a self-contradiction. But a paradoxical and humble courage is required to grasp the whole of the temporal by virtue of the absurd, and this is the courage of faith. By faith Abraham did not renounce his claim upon Isaac, but by faith he got Isaac. By virtue of resignation that rich young man should have given away everything. But then when he had done that, the knight of faith should have said to him, by virtue of the absurd thou shalt get every penny back again. Canst thou believe that? And this speech ought by no means to have been indifferent to the aforesaid rich young man, for in case he gave away his goods because he was tired of them, his resignation was not much to boast of. It is about the temporal, the finite, everything turns in this case. I am able by my own strength to renounce everything, and then to find peace and repose in pain. I can stand everything, even though that horrible demon, more dreadful than death, the king of terrors, even though madness were to hold up before my eyes the motley of the fool, and I understood by its look that it was I who must put it on, I still am able to save my soul, if only it is more to me than my earthly happiness that my love to God should triumph in me. A man may still be able at the last instant to concentrate his whole soul in a single glance toward that heaven from which cometh every good gift, and his glance will be intelligible to himself, and also to him whom it seeks as a sign that he nevertheless remained true to his love. Then he will calmly put on the motley garb. He whose soul has not this romantic enthusiasm has sold his soul, whether he got a kingdom for it or a paltry piece of silver. But by my own strength, I am not able to get the least of the things which belong to finiteness, for I am constantly using my strength to renounce everything. By my own strength I am able to give up the princess, and I shall not become a grumbler but shall find joy and repose in my pain. But by my own strength I am not able to get her again, for I am employing all my strength to be resigned. But by faith, says that marvelous knight, by faith I shall get her in virtue of the absurd. So this movement I am unable to make. As soon as I would begin to make it, everything turns around dizzily, and I flee back to the pain of resignation. I can swim in existence, but for this mystical soaring I am too heavy. To exist in such a way that my opposition to existence is expressed as the most beautiful and assured harmony with it, is something I cannot do. And yet it must be glorious to get the princess. That is what I say every instant, and the knight of resignation who does not say it is a deceiver. He has not had one only wish, and he has not kept the wish young by his pain. Perhaps there was one who thought it fitting enough that the wish was no longer vivid, that the barb of pain was dulled, but such a man is no knight. Thus to get the princess, to live with her joyfully and happily day in and day out, for it is also conceivable that the knight of resignation might get the princess, but that his soul had discerned the impossibility of their future happiness. Thus to live joyfully and happily every instant by virtue of the absurd, every instant to see the sword hanging over the head of the beloved, and yet not. To find repose in the pain of resignation, but joy by virtue of the absurd, this is marvelous. A free-born soul who caught himself entertaining such thoughts would despise himself and begin over again. Above all, he would not permit his soul to be deceived by itself. And yet it must be glorious to get the princess, and yet the knight of faith is the only happy one, the heir apparent to the finite, whereas the knight of resignation is a stranger and a foreigner. In case, then, everyone in my generation who will not stop at faith is really a man who has comprehended life's horror, who has understood what Daub 38 means when he says that a soldier who stands alone at his post with a loaded gun in a stormy night beside a powder magazine will get strange thoughts into his head. In case, then, everyone who will not stop at faith is a man who had strength of soul. To comprehend that the wish was an impossibility, and thereupon gave himself time to remain alone with this thought. In case everyone who will not stop at faith is a man who is reconciled in pain, and is reconciled to pain. in case everyone who will not stop at faith is a man who in the next place. And if he has not done all the foregoing, there is no need of his troubling himself about faith in the next place did the marvelous thing, grasped the whole of existence by virtue of the absurd. Then what I write is the highest eulogy of my contemporaries by one of the lowliest among them, who was able only to make the movement of resignation. He who does it is great, the only great man. The thought of it stirs my soul, which never was niggardly in the admiration of greatness. But why will they not stop at faith? Why does one sometimes hear that people are ashamed to acknowledge that they have faith? This I cannot comprehend. If ever I contrive to be able to make this movement, I shall in the future ride in a coach and four. If it is really true that all the Philistinism I behold in life, which I do not permit my word but my actions to condemn, is not what it seems to be, is it the miracle? That is conceivable, for the hero of faith had in fact a striking resemblance to it, for that hero of faith was not so much an ironist or a humorist, but something far higher. Much is said in our age about irony and humor, especially by people who have never been capable of engaging in the practice of these arts, but who nevertheless know how to explain everything. I am not entirely unacquainted with these two passions, 39, I know a little more about them than what is to be found in German and German-Danish compendiums. I know therefore that these two passions are essentially different from the passion of faith. Irony and humor reflect also upon themselves, and therefore belong within the sphere of the infinite resignation. Their elasticity is due to the fact that the individual is incommensurable with reality. The last movement, the paradoxical movement of faith, I cannot make, be that a duty or whatever it may be, in spite of the fact that I would do it more than gladly. Whether a man has a right to make this affirmation must be left to him. It is a question between him and the eternal being who is the object of faith, whether in this respect he can hit upon an amicable compromise. What every man can do is to make the movement of infinite resignation, and I for my part would not hesitate to pronounce everyone cowardly who wishes to make himself believe he cannot do it. With faith it is a different matter. But what every man has not a right to do is to make others believe that faith is something lowly, or that it is an easy thing, whereas it is the greatest and the hardest. People construe the story of Abraham in another way. They extol God's grace in bestowing Isaac upon him again. The whole thing was only a trial. A trial, that word may say much or little, and yet the whole thing is over as quickly as it is said. One mounts a winged horse, the same instant one is at Mount Moriah, the same instant one sees the ram. One forgets that Abraham rode only upon an ass which walks slowly along the road, that he had a journey of 3 days, that he needed some time to cleave the wood, to bind Isaac, and to sharpen the knife. And yet they extol Abraham. He who is to deliver the discourse can very well sleep till a quarter of an hour before he has to preach. The auditor can well take a nap during the discourse, for all goes smoothly, without the least trouble from any quarter. If there was a man present who suffered from insomnia, perhaps he then went home and sat in a corner and thought, "It's an affair of a moment, this whole thing. If only you wait a minute, you see the ram, and the trial is over." If the orator were to encounter him in this condition, he would, I think, confront him with all his dignity and say, "Wretched man, that thou couldst let thy soul sink into such foolishness. No miracle occurs. The whole of life is a trial." In proportion as the orator proceeds with his outpouring, he would get more and more excited, would become more and more delighted with himself, and whereas he had noticed no congestion of the blood while he talked about Abraham, he now felt how the veins swelled in his forehead. Perhaps he would have lost his breath as well as his tongue if the sinner had answered calmly and with dignity, "But it was about this you preached last Sunday." Let us then either consign Abraham to oblivion, or let us learn to be dismayed by the tremendous paradox which constitutes the significance of Abraham's life, that we may understand that our age, like every age, can be joyful if it has faith. In case Abraham is not a nullity, a phantom, a show one employs for a pastime, then the fault can never consist in the fact that the sinner wants to do likewise. But the point is to see how great a thing it was that Abraham did, in order that man may judge for himself whether he has the call and the courage to be subjected to such a test. The comic contradiction in the behavior of the orator is that he reduced Abraham to an insignificance, and yet would admonish the other to behave in the same way. Should not one dare then to talk about Abraham? I think one should. If I were to talk about him, I would first depict the pain of his trial. To that end, I would like a leech suck all the dread and distress and torture out of a father's sufferings, so that I might describe what Abraham suffered, whereas all the while he nevertheless believed. I would remind the audience that the journey lasted 3 days, and a good part of the 4th, yea, that these 3.5 days were infinitely longer than the few thousand years which separate me from Abraham. Then I would remind them that, in my opinion, every man dare still turn around ere he begins such an undertaking, and every instant he can repentantly turn back. It is now my intention to draw out from the story of Abraham the dialectical consequences inherent in it, expressing them in the form of problemata, in order to see what a tremendous paradox faith is, a paradox which is capable of transforming a murder into a holy act well-pleasing to God, a paradox which gives Isaac back to Abraham, which no thought can master, because faith begins precisely there where thinking leaves off. If one does this, I fear no danger, nor am I afraid of awakening in people an inclination to be tried like Abraham. But if one would dispose of a cheap edition of Abraham, and yet admonish everyone to do likewise, then it is ludicrous. Problem 1 is there such a thing as a teleological suspension of the ethical? The ethical as such is the universal, and as the universal it applies to everyone, which may be expressed from another point of view by saying that it applies every instant. It reposes immanently in itself. It has nothing without itself which is its telos, 40, but is itself telos for everything outside it, and when this has been incorporated by the ethical it can go no further. Conceived immediately as physical and psychical, the particular individual is the individual who has his telos in the universal, and his ethical task is to express himself constantly in it, to abolish his particularity in order to become the universal. As soon as the individual would assert himself in his particularity over against the universal, he sins, and only by recognizing this can he again reconcile himself with the universal. Whenever the individual after he has entered the universal feels an impulse to assert himself as the particular, he is in temptation, anfechtung, and he can labor himself out of this only by penitently abandoning himself as the particular in the universal. If this be the highest thing that can be said of man and of his existence, then the ethical has the same character as man's eternal blessedness, which to all eternity and at every instant is his telos, since it would be a contradiction to say that this might be abandoned, i.e., teleologically suspended, inasmuch as this is no sooner suspended than it is forfeited, whereas in other cases what is suspended is not forfeited, but is preserved precisely in that higher thing which is its telos. 41. If such be the case, then Hegel is right when in his chapter on the good and the conscience. 42. He characterizes man merely as the particular and regards this character as a moral form of evil, which is to be annulled in the teleology of the moral, so that the individual who remains in this stage is either sinning or subjected to temptation, anfechtung. On the other hand, Hegel is wrong in talking of faith, wrong in not protesting loudly and clearly against the fact that Abraham enjoys honor and glory as the father of faith, whereas he ought to be prosecuted and convicted of murder. For faith is this paradox, that the particular is higher than the universal, yet in such a way be it observed that the movement repeats itself, and that consequently the individual, after having been in the universal, now as the particular isolates himself as higher than the universal. If this be not faith, then Abraham is lost, then faith has never existed in the world because it has always existed. For if the ethical, i.e. the moral, is the highest thing, and if nothing incommensurable remains in man in any other way but as the evil, i.e. the particular which has to be expressed in the universal, then one needs no other categories besides those which the Greeks possessed, or which by consistent thinking can be derived from them. This fact Hegel ought not to have concealed, for after all he was acquainted with Greek thought. One not infrequently hears it said by men who for lack of losing themselves in studies are absorbed in phrases that a light shines upon the Christian world whereas a darkness broods over paganism. This utterance has always seemed strange to me, inasmuch as every profound thinker and every serious artist is even in our day rejuvenated by the eternal youth of the Greek race. Such an utterance may be explained by the consideration that people do not know what they ought to say, but only that they must say something. It is quite right for one to say that paganism did not possess faith, but if with this one is to have said something, one must be a little clearer about what one understands by faith, since otherwise one falls back into such phrases. Faith is precisely this paradox, that the individual as the particular is higher than the universal, is justified over against it, is not subordinate but superior, yet in such a way, be it observed, that it is the particular individual who, after he has been subordinated as the particular to the universal, now through the universal becomes the individual who, as the particular is superior to the universal, for the fact that the individual as the particular stands in an absolute relation to the absolute. To explain the whole of existence and faith along with it, without having a conception of what faith is easy, and that man does not make the poorest calculation in life who reckons upon admiration when he possesses such an explanation. For, as Boileau says, unsought trouve toujours un plus sot qui elle admire. This position cannot be mediated, for all mediation comes about precisely by virtue of the universal. It is and remains to all eternity a paradox, inaccessible to thought. And yet faith is this paradox, or else, these are the logical deductions which I would beg the reader to have in ment at every point, though it would be too prolix for me to reiterate them on every occasion. Or else there never has been faith precisely because it always has been. In other words, Abraham is lost. That the whole constitution of many persons may be such that this paradox repels them is indeed true. But one ought not for this reason to make faith something different in order to be able to possess it, but ought rather to admit that one does not possess it, whereas those who possess faith should take care to set up certain criteria, so that one might distinguish the paradox from a temptation. Anfechtung. That for the particular individual this paradox may easily be mistaken for a temptation, Anfechtung, is indeed true, but one ought not for this reason to conceal it. Now the story of Abraham contains such a teleological suspension of the ethical. There have not been lacking clever pates and profound investigators who have found analogies to it. Their wisdom is derived from the pretty proposition that at bottom everything is the same. If one will look a little more closely, I have not much doubt that in the whole world one will not find a single analogy, except a later instance which proves nothing. If it stands fast that Abraham is the representative of faith, and that faith is normally expressed in him, whose life is not merely the most paradoxical that can be thought, but so paradoxical that it cannot be thought at all. He acts by virtue of the absurd, for it is precisely absurd that he as the particular is higher than the universal. This paradox cannot be mediated, for as soon as he begins to do this, he has to admit that he was in temptation Anfechtung, and if such was the case, he never gets to the point of sacrificing Isaac, or, if he has sacrificed Isaac, he must turn back repentantly to the universal. By virtue of the absurd he gets Isaac again. Abraham is therefore at no instant a tragic hero, but something quite different, either a murderer or a believer. The middle term which saves the tragic hero, Abraham has not. Hence it is that I can understand the tragic hero, but cannot understand Abraham, though in a certain crazy sense I admire him more than all other men. Abraham's relation to Isaac, ethically speaking, is quite simply expressed by saying that a father shall love his son more dearly than himself. Yet within its own compass, the ethical has various gradations. Let us see whether in this story there is to be found any higher expression for the ethical, such as would ethically explain his conduct, ethically justify him in suspending the ethical obligation toward his son, without in this search going beyond the teleology of the ethical. When an undertaking in which a whole nation is concerned is hindered 43, when such an enterprise is brought to a standstill by the disfavor of heaven, when the angry deity sends a calm which mocks all efforts, when the seer performs his heavy task and proclaims that the deity demands a young maiden as a sacrifice, then will the Father heroically make the sacrifice. He will magnanimously conceal his pain, even though he might wish that he were the lowly man who dares to weep. 44. Not the king who must act royally. And though solitary pain forces its way into his breast, he has only 3 confidants among the people, yet soon the whole nation will be cognizant of his pain, but also cognizant of his exploit, that for the welfare of the whole he was willing to sacrifice her, his daughter, the lovely young maiden. O charming bosom! O beautiful cheeks! O bright golden hair! v. 687. And the daughter will affect him by her tears, and the father will turn his face away, but the hero will raise the knife. When the intrepid judge 45 who saved Israel in the hour of need in one breath binds himself and God by the same vow, then heroically the young maiden's jubilation, the beloved daughter's joy, he will turn to sorrow, and with her all Israel will lament her maiden youth. But every free-born man will understand, and every stout-hearted woman will admire Jephthah, and every maiden in Israel will wish to act as did his daughter. For what good would it do if Jephthah were victorious by reason of his vow if he did not keep it? Would not the victory again be taken from the nation? When a son is forgetful of his duty 46, when the state entrusts the father with the sword of justice, when the laws require punishment at the hand of the father, then will the father heroically forget that the guilty one is his son. He will magnanimously conceal his pain, but there will not be a single one among the people, not even the son, who will not admire the father. And whenever the law of Rome is interpreted, it will be remembered that many interpreted it more learnedly, but none so gloriously as Brutus. If, on the other hand, while a favorable wind bore the fleet on with swelling sails to its goal, Agamemnon had sent that messenger who fetched Iphigenia in order to be sacrificed, if Jephthah, without being bound by any vow which decided the fate of the Nahon, had said to his daughter, "Bewail now thy virginity for the space of 2 months, for I will sacrifice thee," if Brutus had had a righteous son and yet would have ordered the lictors to execute him, who would have understood them? If these 3 men had replied to the query why they did it by saying, "It is a trial in which we are tested," would people have understood them better? When Agamemnon, Jephthah, Brutus at the decisive moment heroically overcome their pain, have heroically lost the beloved, and have merely to accomplish the outward sacrifice, then there never will be a noble soul in the world who will not shed tears of compassion for their pain and of admiration for their exploit. If, on the other hand, these 3 men at the decisive moment were to adjoin to their heroic conduct this little word, "But for all that it will not come to pass," who then would understand them? If as an explanation they added, "This we believe by virtue of the absurd," who would understand them better? For who would not easily understand that it was absurd, but who would understand that one could then believe it? The difference between the tragic hero and Abraham is clearly evident. When the report of this reaches the ancestral home, then will the beautiful maidens of Greece blush with enthusiasm, and if the daughter was betrothed, her true love will not be angry but be proud of sharing in the father's deed, because the maiden belonged to him more feelingly than to the father. The tragic hero still remains within the ethical. He lets one expression of the ethical find its telos in a higher expression of the ethical relation between father and son, or daughter and father. he reduces to a sentiment which has its dialectic in its relation to the idea of morality. Here there can be no question of a teleological suspension of the ethical itself. With Abraham, the situation was different. By his act, he overstepped the ethical entirely and possessed a higher telos outside of it, in relation to which he suspended the former. For I should very much like to know how one would bring Abraham's act into relation with the universal, and whether it is possible to discover any connection whatever between what Abraham did and the universal, except the fact that he transgressed it. It was not for the sake of saving a people, not to maintain the idea of the state, that Abraham did this, and not in order to reconcile angry deities. If there could be a question of the deity being angry, he was angry only with Abraham, and Abraham's whole action stands in no relation to the universal, is a purely private undertaking. Therefore, whereas the tragic hero is great by reason of his moral virtue, Abraham is great by reason of a purely personal virtue. In Abraham's life there is no higher expression for the ethical than this, that the father shall love his son. Of the ethical in the sense of morality, there can be no question in this instance. In so far as the universal was present, it was indeed cryptically present in Isaac, hidden as it were in Isaac's loins, and must therefore cry out with Isaac's mouth, "Do it not, thou art bringing everything to naught." Why then did Abraham do it? For God's sake, and in complete identity with this for his own sake. He did it for God's sake because God required this proof of his faith. For his own sake, he did it in order that he might furnish the proof. The unity of these 2 points of view is perfectly expressed by the word which has always been used to characterize this situation. It is a trial, a temptation, Fristels. 47. A temptation. But what does that mean? What ordinarily tempts a man is that which would keep him from doing his duty, but in this case the temptation is itself the ethical, which would keep him from doing God's will. But what then is duty? Duty is precisely the expression for God's will. Here is evident the necessity of a new category if one would understand Abraham. Such a relationship to the deity paganism did not know. The tragic hero does not enter into any private relationship with the deity, but for him the ethical is the divine. Hence the paradox implied in his situation can be mediated in the universal. Abraham cannot be mediated, and the same thing can be expressed also by saying that he cannot talk. So soon as I talk I express the universal, and if I do not do so, no one can understand me. Therefore, if Abraham would express himself in terms of the universal, he must say that his situation is a temptation, Anfichtung, for he has no higher expression for that universal which stands above the universal which he transgresses. But he who gives up the universal in order to grasp something still higher which is not the universal, what is he doing? Is it possible that this can be anything else but a temptation, Anfichtung? And if it be possible, but the individual was mistaken, what can save him? He suffers all the pain of the tragic hero, he brings to naught his joy in the world, he renounces everything, and perhaps at the same instant debars himself from the sublime joy which to him was so precious, that he would purchase it at any price. Therefore, though Abraham arouses my admiration, he at the same time appalls me. He who denies himself and sacrifices himself for duty gives up the finite in order to grasp the infinite, and that man is secure enough. The tragic hero gives up the certain for the still more certain, and the eye of the beholder rests upon him confidently. Or if it could be done, but if the individual had misunderstood the deity, what can save him? The tragic hero has need of tears and claims them, and where is the envious eye which would be so barren that it could not weep with Agamemnon? But where is the man with a soul so bewildered that he would have the presumption to weep for Abraham? The tragic hero accomplishes his act at a definite instant. In time, but in the course of time, he does something not less significant. He visits the man whose soul is beset with sorrow, whose breast for stifled sobs cannot draw breath, whose thoughts pregnant with tears weigh heavily upon him. To him he makes his appearance, dissolves the sorcery of sorrow, loosens his corslet, coaxes forth his tears by the fact that in his sufferings the sufferer forgets his own. If then the solitary man who ascends Mount Moriah, which with its peak rises heaven-high above the plain of Aulis, if he be not a somnambulist who walks securely above the abyss, while he who is stationed at the foot of the mountain, and is looking on trembles with fear and out of reverence, and dread dare not even call to him. If this man is disordered in his mind, if he had made a mistakeful thanks, and thanks again to him who proffers to the man, whom the sorrows of life have assaulted and left naked, proffers to him the fig leaf of the word with which he can cover his wretchedness. Thanks be to thee, great Shakespeare, who art able to express everything, absolutely everything, precisely as it is. And yet why didst thou never pronounce this pang? Didst thou perhaps reserve it to thyself, like the loved one whose name one cannot endure that the world should mention? For the poet purchases the power of words, the power of uttering all the dread secrets of others at the price of a little secret he is unable to utter. And a poet is not an apostle. He casts out devils only by the power of the devil. Him the beholder cannot understand, nor let his eye rest confidently upon him. Perhaps it is not possible to do what the believer proposes, since it is indeed unthinkable. One cannot weep over Abraham. One approaches him with a horror religiosus, as Israel approached Mount Sinai. But now, when the ethical is thus teleologically suspended, how does the individual exist in whom it is suspended? He exists as the particular in opposition to the universal. Does he then sin? For this is the form of sin, as seen in the idea. Just as the infant, though it does not sin because it is not as such yet conscious of its existence, yet its existence is sin, as seen in the idea, and the ethical makes its demands upon it every instant. If one denies that this form can be repeated in the adult in such a way that it is not sin, then the sentence of condemnation is pronounced upon Abraham. How then did Abraham exist? He believed. This is the paradox which keeps him upon the sheer edge, and which he cannot make clear to any other man. For the paradox is that he as the individual puts himself in an absolute relation to the absolute. Is he justified in doing this? His justification is once more the paradox. For if he is justified, it is not by virtue of anything universal, but by virtue of being the particular individual. How then does the individual assure himself that he is justified? It is easy enough to level down the whole of existence to the idea of the state or the idea of society. If one does this, one can also mediate easily enough, for then one does not encounter at all the paradox that the individual as the individual is higher than the universal, which I can aptly express also by the thesis of Pythagoras, that the uneven numbers are more perfect than the even. If in our age one occasionally hears a rejoinder which is pertinent to the paradox, it is likely to be to the following effect. It is to be judged by the result. A hero who has become a scandalon 48 to his contemporaries, because they are conscious that he is a paradox who cannot make himself intelligible, will cry out defiantly to his generation, "The result will surely prove that I am justified." In our age we hear this cry rather seldom, for as our age, to its disadvantage, does not produce heroes, it has also the advantage of producing few caricatures. When in our age one hears this saying, it is to be judged according to the result. A man is at once clear as to who it is he has the honor of talking with. Those who talk thus are a numerous tribe, whom I will denominate by the common name of docents. 49 in their thoughts they live secure in existence. They have a solid position and sure prospects in a well-ordered state. They have centuries and even millenniums between them and the concussions of existence. They do not fear that such things could recur, for what would the police say to that? And the newspapers? Their life work is to judge the great, and to judge them according to the result. Surely a man who possesses even a little erecturus ingenii of the higher way of thinking has not become entirely a cold and clammy mollusk, and when he approaches what is great it can never escape his mind that from the creation of the world it has been customary for the result to come last, and that, if one would truly learn anything from great actions, one must pay attention precisely to the beginning. Such behavior toward the great betrays a strange mixture of arrogance and misery. Of arrogance because they think they are called to be judges. Of misery because they do not feel that their lives are even in the remotest degree akin to the great. In case he who should act were to judge himself according to the result, he would never get to the point of beginning. Even though the result may give joy to the whole world, it cannot help the hero, for he would get to know the result only when the whole thing was over, and it was not by this he became a hero, but he was such for the fact that he began. Moreover, the result, inasmuch as it is the answer of finiteness to the infinite query, is in its dialectic entirely heterogeneous with the existence of the hero. Or is it possible to prove that Abraham was justified in assuming the position of the individual with relation to the universal, for the fact that he got Isaac by miracle? If Abraham had actually sacrificed Isaac, would he then have been less justified? But people are curious about the result, as they are about the result in a book. They want to know nothing about dread, distress, the paradox. They flirt aesthetically with the result. It comes just as unexpectedly, but also just as easily as a prize in the lottery. And when they have heard the result, they are edified. And yet no robber of temples condemned to hard labor behind iron bars is so base a criminal as the man who pillages the holy. And even Judas, who sold his master for 30 pieces of silver, is not more despicable than the man who sells greatness. It is abhorrent to my soul to talk inhumanly about greatness, to let it loom darkly at a distance in an indefinite form, to make out that it is great without making the human character of it evident, wherewith it ceases to be great. For it is not what happens to me that makes me great, but it is what I do, and there is surely no one who thinks that a man became great because he won the great prize in the lottery. Even if a man were born in humble circumstances, I would require of him nevertheless that he should not be so inhuman toward himself as not to be able to think of the king's castle, except at a remote distance, dreaming vaguely of its greatness, and wanting at the same time to exalt it, and also to abolish it by the fact that he exalted it meanly. I require of him that he should be man enough to step forward confidently and worthily even in that place. He should not be unmanly enough to desire impudently to offend everybody by rushing straight from the street into the king's hall. By that he loses more than the king. On the contrary, he should find joy in observing every rule of propriety